Hello, everyone. My name is James Knox. I'm chairman of the Boswell Book Festival, and I'm also director of the Fleming Collection, an arts charity which promotes Scottish art and creativity across the UK and beyond, and which has the finest collection of Scottish art from the 17th century to the present day outside museums and art galleries. It gives me great pleasure to pass you over now to James Holloway, who will introduce himself.
I'm James Holloway, and for about 12 years, I was the director of the Scottish National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. And now I'm chairman of the Abbotsford Trust, which looks after the wonderful house of Abbotsford outside Melrose in the Scottish borders, and does everything to promote Scots writing and Scots characters as a great national figure.
So we're here to talk about two portraits. One is in James Holloway's own collection, and one is in the Fleming collection. And they are both by the Scottish artist, George Jameson. James, I'd like you, please, to explain who the artist George Jameson was, and then we will look at the portraits as a pair and then individually.
He was the first really identifiable Scottish portrait painter. When I say portrait painter, almost any painter, because painting in Scotland was really portrait painting much until the end of the 18th century. But George Jameson was working at the beginning of the 17th century, and we know his name, we know really quite a lot about him. We know that he operated out of Aberdeen and out of Edinburgh, and we have quite a corpus of his portraits, and they're very, very good. So he was really a considerable figure. One can see him almost as the father of Scottish art. So that's who he is, and he's a good artist.
Well, is it true to say he really rose out of the wreckage of the Reformation, which had destroyed 95% of all art and artifacts and decorative work in Scotland?
I think that's probably right, although we don't really know very much about earlier painters. We know a little bit about the painters who are associated with the court of James VI in Scotland, people like Adrian Vanson. But what we don't know is, and of course we completely undervalue the quality of what medieval art there must have been in Scotland. The only really example that survives is of staggering importance, and that's the great Van der Goes altar panels, which are on loan from the Queen to the National Galleries of Scotland. And they date from the sort of 1470s, 1480s. And they show James III of Scotland, Queen Margaret of Denmark. And there's nothing comparable in England at the time of that quality. There's very little of that quality elsewhere. I mean, Van der Goes, who painted them, was a major, major European artist. And it's staggering to think that these wonderful paintings hung in the Trinity Chapel in Edinburgh. And one wonders what other wonderful works of art there were, which were completely destroyed at the time of the Reformation. These only survived because they were royal portraits, which is actually germane to what we're talking about when we come on to Jameson.
Let's come on now to the two pictures we want to talk about. One is a portrait of William Wallace, the great Scottish freedom fighter, and the other, the great Scottish King, Robert the Bruce.
What I'm going to say is they're part of a set. There are two survivals, and there are quite a lot of other paintings that survived from this set, which were painted in 1633. And they were painted for a particular occasion, which was really a most important occasion. It was the return to Edinburgh of King Charles I. He'd been born in Dunfermline, and he had really no memory of Scotland at all, because he left when his father, James VI, became king in England. So he really spent all his early life in England. So he returned to Scotland in 1633 to be crowned King of Scots and on a state visit. And a whole series of paintings were made by Jameson in the sort of, in the tradition of continental sort of triumphal returns. And you think of people like Rubens and Van Dyck painting these sort of pictures in the Netherlands. Well, Jameson was the artist chosen to paint the king's forebears, mostly, well, entirely royal, except for William Wallace, and that's interesting. So the two pictures that we're going to be discussing are the two great early Scottish heroes of Scottish independence, William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. the Wallace being the only one that isn't a royal figure. But what I think is interesting about these two is that they're both famous people at the beginning of the 17th century, not well, obviously because of their deeds, but because of the poetry that was written about them. And William Wallace, the poem was written by Blind Harry, Harry the Minstrel, and the Bruce was written by John Barber. So the Bruce dates from about 1375, and Blind Harry's The Wallace dates from about 1475. And those were the poems that kept folk memory of these great fighters for independence alive. So that by the time that the king came up to Scotland, Charles I, in the early 17th century, you couldn't really not have Wallace, because he was such a figure associated with Scottishness and Scottish independence and the Scottish government. But there were no other representations of either Robert the Bruce or William Wallace. So he had to invent, as it were, heroic characters for these people. Now, there was a tradition of heroic portraiture, and usually the men wore armor and helmets and things like that. So that's what he put William Wallace into, and symbols of kingship and things like that. But really, the physical features are entirely invented, and people wouldn't really mind about that. The whole idea of realistic portraiture, which we now think is you know, it's a given, but it wasn't so much a given in the early 17th century. You could invent types. One of the earliest portraits, apart from the Van der Goes picture that I mentioned of James III, James III himself had coins in his own image, which was extraordinary in the British coinage at the time. English coinage for the English monarchs at that period would have just had made up, invented faces. But James III in the late 15th century had a real portrait which shows a real person. So there is that tradition in Scotland.
James, can you tell us a bit about how you came to acquire your portrait of Wallace?
Well, it was very lucky for me, to be absolutely honest, because the picture came up for sale in the local auction house in Edinburgh, but it was miscatalogued, and that's something that every collector longs for. And it did say William Wallace, but it just said Manor of Gerrit van Honthorst, which I suppose isn't untrue, because Jameson was painting in the manner of Gerrit von Honthorst, but the auctioneers didn't realize that it was actually Jameson's original picture. And it wasn't terribly difficult to tell that it was. And I think the estimate was something like £200 to £300. And this was, I think, in about 1988, which was quite a lot of money, but it wasn't a fortune. And fortunately, I was able to buy it, and very, very pleased with it, and I'm very pleased with it ever since. And actually, it's just beside me as I look, and I can look up and see it now.
Given that there was no way there could have been a realistic image already in the 17th century of Wallace, that this, with all its swagger and the influence of the great swagger Flemish school of painting, this is actually very evocative of the spirit of William Wallace.
I think you could say that, although you could say it was very evocative of the spirit of William Wallace as perceived in the early 17th century. We don't really know how Wallace was perceived in his own time, and the poem I mentioned by Blind Harry is written centuries after Wallace's execution. But I think you're absolutely right. It's more like a Walter Scott novel. I mean, it's a take on history, and I think that's interesting. I mean, we read Old Mortality, and we don't expect it to be exactly word for word what happened in the late 17th century in Scotland, any more than we do think Heart of Midlothian is what happened in the mid-18th century in Scotland. But we read them, and we get some historical pleasure and knowledge from them. And think of wonderful novels by Hilary Mantel at the moment, of Thomas Cromwell. They are invented and they are fiction, but they're more than fiction. And I think these portraits are a bit more than just imaginary thing. There's something to grasp hold of.
When it comes to the portrait of Robert the Bruce, which the Fleming collection bought in 2016, and it was the first acquisition that had been made for the collection for some years. And when I became director in 2015, I was asked to look at any gaps in the historical collection, as well as, more contemporary work. And of course, the glaring gap was no George Jameson. And it was absolutely marvelous to be able to buy this work because he really is the founder of modern Scottish painting. And he's, in that sense, himself rather a heroic figure. And this particular painting had been acquired by the vendor, who was actually a great scholar and curator himself in the Scottish National Galleries, at Battle Abbey, which had been the where a number of these pictures have been rediscovered. And perhaps, James, you could tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, New Battle Abbey belonged to the Marquesses of Lothian, and one of the great Scottish families, the Carrs. In the 17th century, when they had huge prominence, I think that the whole set of Scottish monarchs by Jameson, and including Robert the Bruce and William Wallace, went off to the Lothians at that stage, and they were certainly there right the way through, I think, until probably sometime shortly after the Second World War, when they all appeared at auction. Now, that's when my predecessor at the Portrait Gallery, Duncan Thompson, bought Robert the Bruce, but I didn't buy my Wallace at that stage because I wasn't actually living in Scotland. But that's when they all started to appear on the market. And so when I say them all, I'm not quite sure how many survive, and nobody knows how many were painted. But as it were, the Lothians protected them, which is a wonderful thing to have done for several hundred years, and they were safely stored at New Battle Abbey.
It's a marvellous note to end on, the fact that these extraordinary survivals of this triumphal arch, which was erected across the Royal Mile in Edinburgh for Charles I's coronation. And Jameson was very involved in all the proceedings and all the pageantry, which was organised by a poet called William Drummond. And with Jameson, he organised these very elaborate celebrations for the coronation. I love to think of Charles I himself clip-clopping on his charger under the arch and looking up and seeing the great daring-do warrior William Wallace, along with his own Stuart forebear Robert the Bruce, as he went on to be crowned. James, thank you very much.
Thank you.